Thank you, Jane, for that very lovely reading. That's a long chunk of text, and it can be difficult to follow along when a text is so lengthy. And I think it's such a gift when we have readers who guide us so wonderfully there. So my son was just having sort of a meltdown in the back of I think he's gone. I'm like, he's at that age where he's going to know if I'm talking about him, right? He's entered like dangerous pastor kid territory. He's not a baby anymore. I don't really know what he was crying about, but it reminded me that, Mary knows, that I had an experience over the weekend, too, where I just felt like, for no apparent reason, right? Of course, there were reasons, but for no apparent reason, I felt this surge of emotion. I just felt like crying, like I just wanted to cry. And that reminded me that in what we are trying to do at the beginning of a service, when I say like breathe and be where you are and root, that's kind of what I'm asking you to be aware of. And when I say that we're going to create something in this space together, I'm kind of asking you to, is that what you're bringing with you? Or are you bringing a meltdown in the narthex? Because it's okay if you are. Are you bringing a lot of joy? Are you bringing a lot of overwhelm? Did you just come off of a beautiful Saturday and do you have plans to go into something amazing after church? I just want us to pay attention when I ask that question to where we are, where we actually are. Let's pray. Holy, holy, holy God, give us eyes to see and ears to hear. May we find space even for ourselves in your sacred story. Amen. So I'm going to summarize the text for us, even though it was read so beautifully, so that we have it really fresh in our minds where we are located in the biblical witness. So Elijah, in the previous chapter, Elijah is a great prophet in the nation of Israel. He's one of the prophetic all-stars. He's just had this magnificent showdown with the prophets of Baal. The story goes that he they all fell dead or something with his one sword, which is kind of extreme and a little bit weird to think about, but it was that kind of showdown. I get it. For some reason, though, even though he has just had this amazing occurrence where his strength was really on display, or rather God's strength through Elijah was really on display, he is so afraid of this threat that Jezebel makes. Jezebel basically says, I'm going to kill you by this time tomorrow. And it terrifies him so much that he runs. He doesn't stop to pack a bag or tell anyone where he's going. He just takes off. He panics and flees town. And what's interesting in the narrative is he doesn't stop in Beersheba. And Beersheba is legally beyond Jezebel's control. She can't actually kill him there. To kill him there would have started this great, huge thing that she's probably politically savvy enough not to want to start. But he doesn't stop. He's still so panicked. He's still so afraid that he keeps going alone another whole day's journey into the desert, which is not like Bend or Sun River, right? It's not like a nice little vacation. And he probably ends up 100 miles away from where he began. A long, long way away. So he's been going. What's the word? Hoofing it quickly and fast away from her. Logically, he's safe. He's really far away, and it's even past the time of her prophecy. She says, I'll kill you by this time tomorrow. Well, it's way past this time tomorrow. He is geographically and temporally safe from Jezebel's reach, but he's still panicking. He sits under a bush and he asks to die. It is enough. It is too much, he says. Fear is a powerful and irrational motivator. God sends messengers who minister to him, bringing him food and drink, and eventually saying, "Come on, Elijah, you can get up, you can do it, keep going." He spends 40 days and 40 nights then traveling to Mount Horeb, which is also known as Mount Sinai, where God asks him what he's doing there. And Elijah tells God the story, a desperate and lonely story. In response to Elijah's burden, God reveals the holy. The Lord passes by, and we know this story pretty well, right? This is one of those Hebrew Bible stories that we really remember from our childhood. In biblical language, it's called a theophany, which is a fancy word for the appearance of God. It happens very infrequently in the text, so we know to pay attention when it does happen. And then this really beautiful, memorable, Hollywood-like account, Elijah experiences an earthquake and a fire before recognizing God in the sound of silence. And not just silence, but sheer silence. There's a quality to the silence that's not just silence, it's like beyond silence. And when he realizes that the Lord is passing by in that silence, he comes out of the cave that he's been sheltered in, and God asks him again, "What are you doing?" And he gives the very same answer. "I am desperate. I am alone. I am afraid." He doesn't talk about dying again. That's a part of his narrative he doesn't repeat. But he's not fixed either. His experience of God, this revelation of God's self, does not seem to result in the healing of his mental health. And so as we near the end of our quarter focused on mental health as a congregation, let us recognize what is being addressed in this chapter. A human who is tired, discouraged, afraid, and even, according to the biblical account, suicidal. A myth is not something that never happened. A myth is a story that happens over and over again. A myth is not something that never happened. A myth is something that happens over and over and over again. And in this case, whether the story of Elijah is historical fact or not, we have a myth on our hands. This story is a repetition of the Moses story. If we had more time, or this was a Bible study, we could pull out our Bibles and our commentaries and work through all of the allusions and parallels to make this true for you, but we'll point to just a few of them this morning. When Elijah in your text refers to the ancestors he is no better than, he is referring directly to the line of prophets he descends from, and Moses in particular, who you might remember also asks God to die in the book of Numbers. Moses flees for his life. Do you remember why? He kills someone. Moses is a murderer. Elijah flees for his life after killing many, many, many people and being threatened by Jezebel. They flee to the same place. Moses encounters God in the form of a burning bush at Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, the same mountain occupying a central presence in our story this morning. Elijah encounters God in the form of sheer silence in the exact same place. And do you remember that God appears to Moses? God shelters Moses in the shelter of a cliff, in the shadow of his wing as God passes by. Well, the cave that Elijah is in, we are meant to experience it as the exact same cave. God provides food for Moses and the Israelites in the wilderness. God provides food for Elijah in our passage today, right? He's ministered to by the angels with food and drink. Moses and the Israelites spend how many years wandering in the desert? How long does it take Elijah to get up to the mountain? 40 days and 40 nights. These stories, Moses and Elijah, they're so familiar to us in a certain sense, in kind of a cartoon-like sense, right? It's like a Disney movie or the Charles Heston Exodus story. We can see them playing out in our mind's eye, but we don't know them in the way that they are meant to be known. They will only wake us up if we attend to them with a certain quality of spirit. To be open to seeing or hearing something new that might change us. It's actually very hard to be present in that kind of way. It's very difficult to come and sit down in your pew on Sunday morning and expect to need a crash helmet. In the story of Moses, this particular quality of spirit is called turning aside. Moses, who is on the straight and narrow path, turns aside to notice the burning bush. Had he not had the quality of spirit to turn aside, he never would have seen the burning bush. He never would have gotten close enough to experience God in a particular kind of way. And that is really instructive for us this morning. Are we willing to get close enough to the text to really pay attention? The parallel between Moses and Elijah, the one we are probably meant to pay attention to, is not the story that we have spent most of our time reflecting on in church and Sunday school. The parallel that I think we are supposed to be considering is this. Both stories revolve around a refusal to accept what God offers. Refusal to accept the very core of who and what God is. And this is the deeper story, the truest part of the myth that speaks across generations and cultures and times. So we think of, I think this is true, it's certainly true of me, I think of the Exodus story as one of liberation and survival and oppression, and I feel several steps removed from it because most of us aren't enslaved or having to fight for our survival. Most of us wouldn't say that we're actively oppressed. We might be in some ways, but we wouldn't say that maybe our entire universe, most of us, I'm generalizing, of course, which is always dangerous to do in church. But I have privilege and freedom and access. So to get close to the story of Moses, I might spiritualize it in order to identify with it. We have to make the story symbolic to see how it might function for us, as though you and I, don't have access to a primary reading of the text. Are you following me? But what if the symbolic reading is the primary reading of this text? What if it truly functions in a mythological way? A story that repeats itself over and over and over again throughout the course of time and throughout the course of your life. After all, these stories are spiritual texts, right? This is not a historical narrative. The ways in which the stories are meant to wake us up are universal human ways, because the Bible tells stories of life as it is, and humanity as we are. The Exodus story is not just a story about people who need rescued from the hands of Egypt. It is a story about you and I becoming a people who want to emerge from a place of death to a place of life. The project of human liberation for all of us hinges on many, many things, but primarily on an ability to see the possibility of change. hinges on your ability to see the possibility of change. In the story of Moses and Pharaoh and the people, both the Egyptians and the Israelites, we bear witness through this story to a psychological reality, a resistance to God's redemptive promise, an unwillingness to be open to an alternative reality. Do you remember all the protests that happen in the Exodus story? How many times the people complain? How many times they actually end up wanting to go back to their oppressors? Remember what Moses says he can't do? I can't speak. I'm heavy of tongue. He says no to God over and over and over again. He offers a myriad of excuses and obstacles, all saying no to the freedom and liberation that God is offering. Moses stands in for a problem that God has with people, with humanity, in trying to do the work of redemption. Because we do a very good job of resisting the freedom and liberation that God offers us. Because the prisons we know are at least familiar, right? Comfortable. And the question the story asks us timelessly across cultures is, can we arouse ourselves enough to be open to God, to see our capacity to be redeemed? And that is the myth that is on repeat with Elijah. Elijah is locked in a different kind of prison. He's held captive by fear. And the story tells us that Elijah's captor is as powerful as Pharaoh. We don't know why Elijah is so scared of Jezebel, and we don't have to. Because what we're reminded and invited to remember in this story is our own fear, which is a universal human experience, right? You buy that? Everyone's always been afraid. There's never been a point in time in which we haven't been afraid. To be scared, lonely, desperate, depressed, even suicidal, these are universal experiences. And in this narrative, Elijah is unable to see a different reality. That's why he answers God the same way twice, isn't it? Even after he's borne witness to heavenly messengers, divine intervention, and even a theophany, even getting to be in the presence of God isn't enough. And that is part of the human experience, being unable to see beyond what is happening right now. To need liberation, but not yet have eyes to see the possibility of change. We are human. This is kind of how it is. So what are you doing? I wonder how you might think about asking or answering that question this morning, the same question that God asked Elijah. What are you doing? I don't have to know what your prison is, whether it's fear or doubt or addiction, to know that you have one. And I don't care how old you are, how smart you are, how whatever you are, I don't care. I know you have a prison. And I also know that the project of being human is emerging from places of death to places of life. And it's not just some people's project, it's everyone's project. The reason the story of finding our own liberation has mythological status, not only within the Torah, but the Christian scriptures as well, and the scriptures, the sacred texts that belong to all of the world's major traditions, it's because that is a universally true story. What does it look like to move from death to life? To do that work, though, you have to be able to answer a question. What are you doing? You have to be able to answer the question that God asked Elijah. Do you know the prison that holds you captive? You also have to be able to see an alternative reality. You have to believe that you could do differently, that you can choose who and how you will become. You have to nurture the capacity of spirit to turn away from what you know and consider that that thing over there, that freedom and liberation you just don't believe is possible for yourself, is actually not only possible, but belongs to you. We are people who are becoming. We are not people who have arrived at our freedom, but we are people who, like Moses and Elijah, can only sometimes catch a glimpse of what it would mean to live in that reality where we are free and beloved and whole. And we can only sometimes see where we're in our own way. But the more I think we attend to our spirits and we show up in places and give time and attention to the work of our inner lives, the more that muscle is strengthened. That muscle that is our capacity to turn away from death and toward life. I think that in this primary story of what it means to be human, that as humans we are always in the process of becoming, we get that metaphor from God, from who and how and what God is. In the story of the burning bush, what is the thing that happens? Why is that such a big story for us? You're still not quite awake. Thank you. We should serve coffee in the pews. In the story of the burning bush, the name of God is revealed, right? In Hebrew, it is Ahyeh Asher Ahyeh. And we translate it differently. But it means I am becoming who I am becoming. That's a name God reveals. I am becoming who I am becoming. It means that the very principle of becoming, the very principle of allowing the possible to happen, is who and what and how God is. And it is also who and what and how you are. Amen.